Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we're taking on a really big topic, one that's often surrounded by a lot of judgment, a lot of misinformation: addiction.
Right.
Our mission today is pretty clear. We want to unpack what the clinical definition of addiction actually means,
Hmm.
using the criteria from the DSM-5 and critically grounding it all in neuroscience.
Mm.
Because for so many people who are struggling, there's this deep private conflict. They might look at the old stereotype of an addict, the destructive caricature.
Yeah, and they think, that's not me.
Exactly. They reject it. But then they look at their own life and they realize they are completely unable to stop a pattern they know is harming them. They're caught in this tension, the one that makes them think, I'm not an addict, but I also can't stop.
And that internal friction
Mm.
is exactly what modern science is trying to address.
Hmm.
The research now is all about shifting the conversation away from,
I
morality
don't blame.
and toward biology. Our source material for this deep dive is based heavily on work that aims to destigmatize the condition. We're leaning a lot on the work in the neuroscience of addiction by Francesca Mapua-Philby, because understanding the neurobiology, it isn't an excuse, it's context. It is the absolute first step toward finding real, lasting change.
Okay.
And we have to say this right up front. It's really important. This deep dive is for educational purposes only.
Yes.
It is not a substitute for professional, medical, or psychological advice. If you hear these patterns in yourself or in someone you love, please just reach out and get help from a qualified professional.
Okay, so let's start with how the thinking has evolved, because
Yeah.
the language we use, it's been a huge part of the problem, a huge part of the stigma,
It really has. We're moving away from these older, really judgmental terms.
like drug abuse or drug dependence.
Exactly. The American Psychiatric Association saw this needed a complete overhaul. So with the DSM-5 back in 2014, those categories were replaced. Now there's just one single unified term: substance use disorders, or SUDs.
And the key word there isn't addiction with all its baggage.
Yeah.
It's disorder. And the key concept is the spectrum.
Precisely. The most critical part of the SUD framework is that it sees this as a chronic progressive process. It exists on a continuum of severity.
So it's not like a switch you flip. You're not just fine one day and an addict the next. It's a range.
It's a range. And that means someone who's struggling isn't necessarily jumping straight to a severe diagnosis.
So how is that severity defined clinically?
It's based on the number of symptoms. There are 11 total diagnostic criteria, and it's about how many of those a person has experienced over a 12-month period. So if you meet 2 to 3 of those criteria, it's classified as a mild SUD.
Okay.
4 to 5 symptoms, that's a moderate SUD. And if you meet 6 or more, all the way up to 11, you're diagnosed with a severe SUD.
And that spectrum is so important. It validates that the impairment, the struggle, is real at many different levels.
It does. And this is where the science directly confronts that old, moralizing view of addiction.
All right, let's get into our first clip moment here. Stigma versus science.
For generations, addiction was seen as a disorder of free will, a failure of character,
A moral failing.
a moral failing. But if that were true, if it were just about willpower, the data would look completely different. I mean, think about alcohol. It's everywhere. Epidemiological studies show something like 52% of American adults are current regular drinkers. That's a huge number of people using a known addictive substance.
Right, a massive group.
Yet, only about 10% of that drinking population ever develops a true substance use disorder. And that huge gap, that chasm between the number of people who use and the small fraction who get addicted, it proves that biology, neurology, genetics, they are central to the equation.
It's a risk equation, not a character test.
Exactly.
So if the brain is the risk factor, then we need to know what's changing in the brain. What behaviors do those changes create? To make this really tangible for you, we've grouped the 11 DSM-5 criteria into 4 simple themes. This isn't just a dry checklist. It's about real-world behaviors.
Okay, let's start with group 1. Loss of control and compulsion.
This is the core shift, right?
This is it. This
Yeah.
is the signal that you're moving from voluntary use to compulsive seeking. The criteria here are things like taking the substance in larger amounts or for longer than you intended, having a persistent desire to cut down, or making unsuccessful efforts to control your use, and spending a great deal of time, an enormous amount of time, just getting, using, or recovering from the substance.
That point about time, that's often the first red flag people notice themselves. It's not the hour you spend using, it's the 4 hours before planning it and then the 8 hours after recovering. It just consumes your life.
It does. And the DSM-5 also specifically added craving as its own criterion.
And what's the clinical definition of that?
It's defined as an intense, often overwhelming desire to use or get the substance. This isn't just a passing thought. It's a powerful, pathological, motivational state that drives your behavior above almost everything else.
That brings up a question, though. We usually connect substance use with pleasure, with the high. If it stops being pleasurable, why does the craving stick around? Why does the body keep seeking it?
That's maybe the most fascinating part, and it gets us to our second clip moment, the nature of craving.
Okay.
The incentive sensitization theory explains this. Addiction creates this profound shift in the brain. It moves away from liking, the actual feeling of pleasure.
Euphoria.
Right. And it moves toward compulsive wanting, a pathological motivation to seek. Your brain's deep survival centers, they get hijacked. For example, studies on individuals with cocaine use disorder show that when they're just exposed to drug cues, those cues light up the amygdala. That's a core part of your survival system.
So the substance becomes the most important thing in the environment.
The single most evocative, most salient stimulus. It just overrides basic reasoning, even if the person doesn't actually enjoy the experience anymore.
Wow. So the brain is actively reprogramming itself to want something it might not even like anymore.
It's prioritizing the seeking behavior itself. That's the tragedy of losing control.
Which brings us to our second theme, group 2, social and role impairment. This is where the consequences start to become really visible to the outside world, where the life that was built around the persons starts to, erode.
Yeah, the criteria here are pretty clear. It's recurrent use that results in a failure to fulfill your major obligations. Work, school, home.
You start missing things.
You do. You also see important social, occupational, or recreational activities being given up. And critically, you continue to use, despite having persistent social or interpersonal problems that are caused by the substance.
The key insight there is, it's not just that you're using a drug. It's the slow, measurable disappearance of everything else that actually matters to you.
A good way to picture this is through tangible losses. The student who stops going to class because they're too sick or anxious. The parent who starts avoiding their own kids' school events because they'd rather use a loan.
The impact is just devastating.
It is. I mean, substance use directly increases the risk of dropping out of school. Roughly 1 in 6 unemployed people use substances. This isn't just a statistic. It is a clear erosion of your ability to function in the world.
Okay, that leads right into group 3, which is about risky use and impairment.
Right.
This is where the behavior persists even when the person is facing clear, immediate danger. It crosses a line from just harmful to genuinely self-destructive. And on some level, the person knows it.
Correct. The criteria here are, honestly, chilling. It's recurrent use in situations where it's physically hazardous.
Driving while intoxicated is the classic example.
The classic example. And fMRI studies show exactly why. It reduces brain activation in areas you need for attention and motor control. The second criterion is continuing to use despite knowing you have a persistent physical or psychological problem that was likely caused or made worse by the substance.
That's the point where the doctor says, if you keep doing this, you are going to end up in the hospital, and the person just can't stop.
The loss of control is so complete, it actually overrides the basic instinct for survival.
Okay, finally, we get to the fourth theme, group 4. Physical adaptation. This is what most people think of first. The classic physiological markers, tolerance and withdrawal.
Right, so tolerance just means you need markedly increased amounts of the substance to get the effect you want.
Or the same amount just doesn't work anymore.
Exactly, a diminished effect.
Yeah.
And withdrawal is that substance-specific syndrome. It can be physical or psychological. That happens when you stop abruptly.
Or you take the substance again just to avoid feeling those withdrawal symptoms.
Precisely.
Okay, let's pause here, because this is where the popular idea of addiction often gets it really wrong. A lot of people assume that if you have tolerance and withdrawal, that means you're addicted.
Right.
But that is not the whole story, is it?
No, not at all. And it's crucial to understand this. Tolerance and withdrawal symptoms are purely physical adaptations. It's just your brain trying to maintain homeostasis. Balance, exactly. In the face of a substance being there all the time, the brain adjusts. It might downregulate receptors. Think about someone on prescribed pain medication for a chronic illness. They will absolutely develop tolerance, and they will experience withdrawal if they stop abruptly.
But they haven't necessarily developed a substance use disorder.
Precisely. The key difference is whether the person has lost behavioral control over the substance. not just whether their body has adapted to it.
Okay.
Addiction is where that compulsive seeking continues long after the drug stops being fun. Researchers like George Koob call this the dark side of addiction. The compulsion is no longer about chasing a euphoric high. It's about avoiding the awful negative emotional state, the dysphoria that happens when you're abstinent.
So it's a dysregulation of the body's stress system. The motivation shifts from seeking pleasure to avoiding pain.
That's a much more powerful driver. And the physical changes in the brain that fuel this are remarkably persistent.
Which brings us to our final clip moment, persistence in death.
To really understand how chronic these changes are, just consider this startling fact from a 2016 study. Researchers looked at brain tissue from deceased heroin addicts. They found that the key protein linked to chronic craving, you can think of it as a dependence memory switch, was still detectable.
In the brain tissue?
In the nucleus accumbens, a key reward center 9 days after the person had died.
9 days.
It just shows that this is a long-lasting molecular-level change to your motivational hardware. It persists long after you're even able to use the substance.
That is a powerful and, frankly, a chilling reason why sustained recovery is such a monumental challenge. You're fighting profound biological changes that outlast any immediate detox.
It's a long road.
Okay, so given that so many people who are struggling resist that formal label, but they know they're stuck in a destructive cycle, let's shift to some practical tools. This is not about diagnosing yourself. This is about giving you a structure for honest self-reflection using the themes we just talked about. It can be really overwhelming to look at the whole picture. So let's start with reflection tool number 1. What is it costing me?
This one ties directly back to those consequences we discussed in groups 2 and 3, the social impairment and the risky use.
So just mentally, list the costs. What financial, what relational, what health or job costs have piled up because of the substance use? And maybe more importantly, what important, enjoyable activity, social, recreational, whatever, have you given up or cut back on in favor of using?
It just refocuses your mind on the loss that's associated with the use. It makes the consequences real.
Right. And the second tool focuses on that core conflict of control. Reflection tool number 2. What happens when I try to stop?
This links directly back to groups 1 and 4, compulsion and adaptation.
So when you actually try to cut back or to stop completely, is there an intense, overwhelming desire, that craving to start again? And are you immediately hit with negative emotional or physical symptoms, that withdrawal dysphoria we talked about that just compels you to use again to make it stop?
If you reflect on those 2 questions and the answers give you real concern or distress, that's a very strong sign that professional help is needed and that it's warranted. Remember, understanding this as a chronic brain disease is the whole foundation of recovery. To put the relapse rates in perspective,
Yeah.
the rate of recurrence for substance use disorders is very similar to other chronic illnesses we all know about, things like type 1 diabetes, hypertension, and asthma.
They all hover around pretty similar rates of recurrence, which just underscores that treatment, specialized treatment, not just willpower or punishment. That's the necessary and the compassionate response.
Absolutely.
Understanding reliance is the very first step toward reducing the shame. As always, the full sources we use for this deep dive, including that work by Francesca Mapua-Filby, are all linked in the description below.
And if you'd like a simple checklist worksheet that summarizes these criteria themes, the 4 groups we walk through, just comment the word checklist below.
Next time, we're going to connect the science directly to social factors. We'll explore how stigma and public perception and even bad policy, how they all create these huge, unnecessary hurdles for people trying to recover.
And how that keeps the destructive loop alive.
Meet us in Episode 3, Stigma versus Science, How Shame Keeps People Stuck. We'll see you then.